It started with a signature on a dotted line, the kind of ordinary act that people perform every day without a second thought. She trusted him, trusted his smile, his promises, the gentle way he brushed aside her questions with assurances that everything was under control. For years she had built her life around him, her work, her savings, her plans for the future intertwined with his word. It wasn't until the letters began to arrive, heavy envelopes stamped with red warnings, that she realized something had gone terribly wrong. At first, she thought it must be a mistake. She had always been careful. Her bills were paid on time, her records meticulous, her goals modest but steady. Yet the numbers stared back at her in black ink, numbers that didn't belong to her, debts she had never signed for, accounts that had been emptied without her knowledge. He had used her name, her trust, her silence. Piece by piece, her financial security had been siphoned away until there was almost nothing left. The betrayal did not come with a single loud explosion, but with a quiet erosion. One day the fridge hummed normally, the lights turned on, her savings app showed stability. The next, her phone buzzed with collectors, and the bank refused her simplest requests. She confronted him at first with confusion rather than anger. Surely there was some explanation. But when she met his eyes, there was no remorse, only a chilling absence of recognition, as if she were just another account to exploit, another asset already spent. She left with nothing but a box of clothes and the documents she could salvage. The apartment they had shared was no longer hers. The car was repossessed within weeks. Friends she thought were loyal melted away, afraid that her misfortune might somehow rub off on them. Family offered sympathy, but little else. For the first time in her adult life, she stood in the middle of the world, stripped bare of safety, of stability, of the illusion she had clung to for so long. The nights were the hardest. She lay awake with numbers circling her mind, bills she could not pay, wages she could not stretch, questions she could not answer. For a while, despair was her only companion, whispering that she had been ruined permanently, that she was foolish for ever trusting, that she should simply stop trying. But despair has a peculiar way of burning itself out. In its ashes, something harder, sharper began to grow. She started small. A second job cleaning offices at night. Long hours hunched over a laptop learning about debt, credit, and the labyrinth of financial law that once intimidated her, but now became her weapon. Each week, she chipped away at the mess, calling creditors, negotiating settlements, refusing to be shamed into silence. The woman who once allowed others to handle the paperwork now handled it herself, with an iron will born from necessity. It was not quick and it was not pretty. She stumbled more than once, fell behind on payments, ate meals of bread and soup when money was scarce. But the same stubbornness that had once made her loyal to the wrong man now fueled her loyalty to herself. Her work ethic became legendary among colleagues, who noticed the way she never complained, never asked for sympathy, only moved forward. She began to freelance, using skills she had underestimated in herself, slowly transforming side jobs into steady income. 2 years later, the woman who had been broken and discarded was unrecognizable. Her debts, once mountains, had dwindled to hills, and the hills shrank month by month. She had rebuilt her credit, saved enough for her own small apartment, and begun investing with the knowledge she had painstakingly taught herself. When she looked in the mirror, she no longer saw the trusting woman who had been betrayed, but someone forged in fire, someone tempered by survival. She saw him once, by chance, across the street. He had the same careless smile, the same easy stride, but she no longer felt the sting of loss. There was no anger either, only a calm acknowledgement. He had destroyed the version of her who was naive, but in doing so, he had created the version who now stood tall. She did not need revenge. Her existence, her success, her hard-won independence was vengeance enough. They call it the phoenix effect for a reason, the bird that dies in flame and is reborn from its ashes. She had lived it, burned down to nothing but charred remains of trust and security, only to rise brighter, fiercer, unstoppable. And this time, she swore to herself, no one would ever again hold the matches to her wings. The years that followed were not a straight climb, but a jagged path filled with setbacks that tested her resolve. After clearing the first wave of debt, she found herself staring at the deeper scars left by betrayal, not just financial, but emotional. Money was one thing to rebuild, trust was another. Every interaction felt suspect. When someone offered help, she wondered what they wanted in return. When she heard a laugh that felt too smooth, too charming, her stomach tightened. She had learned the cost of misplaced faith, and it was a lesson her bones would never forget. Work became both sanctuary and battleground. She threw herself into it with a ferocity that startled her colleagues. Overtime hours became routine, not out of desperation anymore, but out of determination. She wanted more than survival, she wanted mastery. She studied after shifts, taking online courses, reading until dawn about investment strategies, entrepreneurship, and the psychology of negotiation. The woman who once signed papers without reading them now dissected contracts word by word, as if they were puzzles that dared to deceive her. With knowledge came power, and with power came opportunity. She noticed patterns others overlooked, found ways to streamline processes, and solved problems no one else wanted to touch. Soon, her employers leaned on her expertise, and whispers began to circulate about her uncanny ability to turn messes into miracles. That reputation became her leverage, and she used it to climb into better roles, better pay, and eventually, independence. But success didn't erase the past, it reshaped it. She found herself haunted not by him, but by herself, the version of her who had been blind, unquestioning, willing to surrender everything for the illusion of love. Sometimes, she stood at the window of her small apartment, staring at the city lights, wondering how she could have given so much of herself away. The shame cut deeper than the debt ever had. Slowly, she realized that healing required more than rebuilding finances. It required forgiving herself. That was the hardest battle of all. To admit that her mistakes had not defined her forever, that her trust had not been weakness, but a strength misplaced, took time. She began journaling, writing out the story of her downfall and rise, page by page, until the weight of silence finally lifted. And then something remarkable happened. Others began to find her. At first it was a coworker, embarrassed to admit she had been tricked by a business partner. Then it was a distant cousin, whose marriage had left her penniless. Later, strangers online who stumbled upon her words and recognized themselves in her pain. They asked how she had survived, how she had begun again, and in telling them her story, she discovered a new purpose. Her journey was no longer just about herself. It became about showing others that ruin was not the end, but the beginning. She started workshops, then a small consulting service, teaching people how to recognize red flags, protect themselves financially, and rebuild from betrayal. The same ashes that had nearly smothered her became the soil from which countless others grew. Years later, when she looked back, she realized that the betrayal had not destroyed her, it had revealed her. She was not the naive woman she once despised, nor only the hardened fighter she had become. She was something more, resilient, compassionate, and unbreakably her own. The ashes had not just birthed a phoenix, they had birthed a guide fire for others stumbling in the dark. And so, her life stood as proof of a truth she once could not believe. Destruction is not always the end. Sometimes, it is the fire that makes flight possible. There were mornings when she still woke with the heaviness of the past pressing on her chest. It wasn't only the memory of his betrayal that lingered, but the memory of who she had been during those years, the quiet compliance, the unquestioning belief that love was enough to anchor two people against the storm of life. Those mornings, she would sit by the window with her coffee, staring at the rising sun, reminding herself that the light was proof of her own endurance. The world kept moving, and so did she. Her first real breakthrough came when she dared to take a risk again. It was a business venture, something she would never have considered before. A small consulting project for a local firm that was floundering financially. She poured her evenings into analyzing their accounts, restructuring their spending, and negotiating better contracts on their behalf. When they pulled through, she realized she had stumbled onto more than just recovery, she had found her calling. For the first time since everything collapsed, she felt not only secure, but powerful. Still, her past followed her like a shadow. He reappeared one day, not in person, but through whispers. A friend of a friend mentioned his name, said he was running new schemes, preying on others as he once had on her. The old fury rose in her, the desire to confront him, to expose him, to make him pay. But when she caught herself rehearsing those thoughts, she stopped cold. The fire that had nearly consumed her once was not meant to be wasted on vengeance. She chose instead to pour it into her work, her growth, her own life. That was her triumph, living well, not wasting her soul on someone who no longer deserved space in her story. As her consulting grew, she began meeting more women who carried scars like hers. Some whispered their stories in hushed voices over coffee. Others confessed through tears in late-night emails. Each tale was different, but the pattern was always the same: trust broken, security stolen, dignity battered. Listening to them, she saw herself reflected back, and each time she offered advice, she found herself healing a little more. Helping others became her way of reclaiming the years she thought she had lost. There came a moment, years later, when she stood on a stage at a conference, speaking to an audience of hundreds. The spotlight was hot against her skin, her heart thundered in her chest, but her voice did not tremble. She told her story, plain, unvarnished, unapologetic. She described how betrayal had stripped her bare, how she had clawed her way back, how she had learned that resilience was not an abstract word but a daily choice. The applause that followed was not what mattered. What mattered were the faces, the tears, the sparks of recognition in the eyes of people who suddenly believed they, too, could rise. In that moment she understood that she had truly become the phoenix. Not just because she had survived, not just because she had risen, but because she carried the fire within her now. The ashes were no longer a prison, they were fuel. She had taken the very thing that had destroyed her and transformed it into power, into purpose, into proof. And every day forward, she lived with the quiet certainty that nothing, no betrayal, no loss, no storm, could ever burn her down again. She had already been to the fire, and she had come out with wings. The fire of her life was not a single blaze, but a long series of sparks, some bright, some painful. After the conference, after the applause and the nods of recognition, she found herself walking alone through the city streets at night, letting the quiet soak into her bones. For years she had been chasing survival, then chasing stability, then chasing purpose. But that evening, for the first time, she slowed down long enough to ask herself what she truly wanted, not just what she needed to prove to the world, but what would fill her own heart. It was a terrifying question because it required honesty. Beneath the armor she had built, she still longed for connection. She still dreamed, in secret moments, of trust without fear, of love without betrayal. But she no longer wanted to be rescued. That girl, the one who thought security came from another person's promises, was gone. What she wanted now was partnership, two fires burning side by side, neither one dimming for the other. When a man from her professional circle asked her to dinner, she hesitated for days before answering. The old instinct screamed caution, but the stronger voice, the one forged from her rebirth, reminded her that fear could not be her guide forever. So she went, not as the woman who once folded herself small to please someone, but as the woman who had survived ashes. She laughed when she wanted to laugh, challenged him when she disagreed, and walked away at the end of the evening knowing that whether or not he called again, she had already won. Her financial life grew into something she never imagined. The consulting practice she had begun with desperation became an agency, then a firm. She hired others who had known betrayal, people who understood the sharp edges of loss and the hunger to rebuild. They didn't just offer financial advice, they offered empathy, a kind of quiet revolution in an industry that often thrived on intimidation. She called it ashes to armor, a name that reminded her daily where she had come from. There were setbacks still, because life never stopped testing. A deal that collapsed, a client who betrayed her trust, a friend who drifted away. But the difference now was that she no longer fell apart when things broke. She had learned that everything could burn, but she could burn brighter. Instead of despair, she carried perspective. Instead of fear, she carried fire. One night, years after the betrayal that had almost destroyed her, she sat in her apartment, no longer small, no longer borrowed, but hers, with windows overlooking a skyline she had claimed through her own work. She pulled out the box she had carried with her from the very beginning, old bank letters, contracts with his forged signature, notes she had once written in panic. For a long moment she sifted through them, feeling the weight of what they once meant. Then, calmly, she fed each paper into the fireplace. The flames consumed the ink, the numbers, the lies. She watched until the last scrap turned to glowing embers, and then to ash. It wasn't anger that filled her chest, or even sadness. It was peace. She did not need reminders anymore. Her story was no longer defined by what had been taken from her, but by what she had built with her own hands. She leaned back in her chair, watching the fire fade, and whispered aloud the words that had become her truth. I am not what I lost. I am what I rose from. And outside her window, the city hummed on, unaware that one more phoenix had taken flight above its rooftops, wings stretched wide, unstoppable.